Hello and welcome to the One Shot Podcast, the cricket podcast of the Sports Gazette. I'm Aayush, your host for today. And as usual, I've got the band with me, Toby and Michael. Toby, how are you?
Yeah, excited, really excited. Should be a good podcast. Got some guests on later, which I'll tease there. But first video podcast as well, so it's exciting.
Exciting times. Michael, thoughts on today?
Yeah,
Excited?
excited to put faces to names after 19 episodes. We're finally on camera. So yeah, looking forward to it.
As the guy said, today is our first video podcast. For those of you who listen to the podcast on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you get your podcasts, you can head to the Sports Gazette website and on the Sports Gazette YouTube pages where you will see today's video podcast. So, guys, another reason that this is a special episode today is not just, of course, it's the first video podcast, but it's the second consecutive one-shot podcast where we're talking about women's cricket exclusively today. And today's focus is going to be the women's test that's coming up, India versus England, that's happening at the D.Y. Patil Stadium in Navi Mumbai, starting tomorrow. Well, before we speak about it among ourselves, I'll ask Toby and Michael their thoughts on the test as well and on women's test cricket in general. We're first going to see what Nick Friend, who's a cricketer with the journalist, had to say on this topic. You might remember Nick Friend from one of our previous episodes, and Sports Gazette's Evie Ashton spoke to Nick just earlier this week to get his thoughts on everything.
First topic that I wanted to touch on with you today is just the lack of women's test cricket in general, and to give listeners a bit of context to this debate. So it starts from the stats I've found. There's been 288 women's test matches compared to over 2,000 men's test matches. And then there's not only that gender discrepancy, but also within the teams in women's international cricket, there's huge inequalities. So like Australia played 26, and then you look at South Africa who played 13, Sri Lanka played 1. So there's obviously that huge team discrepancy. And then more stats, India have not hosted a test match since 2014. And the one on Thursday, pretty much 8-9 years. And that they played against South Africa in 2014. And then there's from the ICC Future Tours programme, there were 7 tests announced between 2022 and 2025. So that only 7, which is not a lot. And it's only England, Australia, India, South Africa that are the ones with scheduled matches, leaving out a lot of countries. And England are not playing a test match in summer. So with all of that in mind, all of that context, what are your thoughts on the situation? Should there be more test matches? Should there not be more test matches? What would that look like? Kind of where do you sit in this whole debate?
I can't see why, at the very least, there can't be a test in every. I think what women's cricket's has done really well is create these multi-format series where there is context and relevance to everything, and actually within that there is definitely space for a test match in every multi-format series. And I think it is also probably true to say that there are some cases where you'd be looking at a mismatch and perhaps it isn't not say worthwhile, but how I know Sri Lanka won the T20 series, let's say, in England last year, but what actually as the format got longer and they played the ODI series, it was extremely one-sided, and teams at different stages of development. I don't necessarily think there is always a case for every series to or every matchup to include a test, but I can't see why in the marquee series of every certainly every English summer, and certainly when England's I guess talking this for England, I guess Anglo-centric talking here, I can't see why there isn't the option for one. Frankly, for no other reason that if you ask the players what they want to play more test cricket. Anastasia Richards made a 100 on test debut. When was it? 2022 against South Africa. She wasn't picked for 2020. She wasn't picked for the Ashes test, and she's not in the squad in India. It's very possible that she'll retire having played one test, having batted once, having made 107. And you look at that, and that would just never happen. That would just never happen in the men's game. And granted, these things are not necessarily comparable, between the men's game and the women's game, just because I guess the resource involved, the resource the men's game has had for a lot longer than the women's game. But when Susie Bates says that she would love to play a test match, it seems mental that someone who's given that much New Zealand cricket for almost 2 decades hasn't played one. It seems mad that, as you said before, India haven't hosted for 10 years. or coming up to 10 years. New Zealand haven't played one since 2004. I think it's the same with Pakistan, same with West Indies. Obviously, and I guess I think Sri Lanka haven't played one this century. And yeah, as you say, 7 Test matches and this Future Tours program was sort of sold as this like sign of progress, because it was more than, I think, what was it, 4 in the previous one, I want to say. So I think, frustratingly, as ever with the women's game, it is. I can't remember. I can't remember who said this. It might have been. I don't want to say it was Tony Beaumont. It might not have been. But too often the women's game are tiny gains presented as massive gains. And from 4 to 7, if it was 4, I can't quite remember if it was, but it was fewer than 7, which is the main point. That is not some massive step up. England will play ordinarily at least 6 or 7 in a year. England men will play at least six or 7 a year. So, and yeah, as I say, if you speak to the players, they love it. They want to play more of it, and I'm sure we'll get to this in a bit. But it becomes much harder to get good at it if you're playing so sporadically. I mean, Heather Knight is a very good Test match cricketer, but she plays 1 a year, and she's talked before about how essentially that means when you go and play, when you do get a game, you can't necessarily play the way that England want to play their cricket at the moment, which is aggressive, fearless, because you're desperate to play Test cricket. And you might have 1 game a year, which means you've got maximum 2 innings a year. And if you go in there and get caught mid off the ball trying to clear the field, then that might be your test knock for 2023. So, whereas it's much easier for England's men, for example, to play baseball, as it were, because if you fail today, you'll get another go in 2 days, and you'll get another go in a week down the line. It's a 4-match series or a 5-match series, and then and you can develop your game and improve your game. Whereas at the moment, each one is played as an exhibition almost, and every preview you sort of feel bad sitting there in a press conference asking the same old questions to whoever's put up about would you like to play more Test cricket? What's it mean to be playing a Test here, and what's it mean to be playing a Test there? Like you seem to go around in circles a bit with it, despite as I say, despite the will of the players being very much in favour of playing more of it. Because ultimately, particularly this era, well, I guess still this era, you've got a lot of players who grew up in an age before women's cricket was regularly televised, let's say, certainly or beyond televised. I guess certainly wasn't advertised or marketed in the same way as now, which means actually a lot of players grew up watching the England men of 2005, let's say. If you grew up on 2005, you grew up on Test cricket, you grew up on, that's what got you into the game, so you want to play it, whether you're male, female, 20, 40, whatever. So that is I've probably answered more than one question there, but that's my general thought is if the players want to do it and it objectively makes the game stronger, then it seems. And also when we have tests, that aren't rain affected anyway, they tend to be really good games. I mean, the Ashes test this year was a good game of cricket. The previous Ashes test in where was that, Canberra, was a fantastic game that England frankly should have won and then almost lost. But part of the reason they lost that, they will say, is because they've got no frame of reference for how to. I mean, England haven't won a test in a decade, but that doesn't mean they've lost 50 games. It means they've not won in. I'm going to throw another number out. I think it's 7. It could be 9. But point being, they've just not played very many.
Yeah, and with the players wanting to play so many Test matches, then what would you say is, to what extent does infrastructure play a role in stopping that happening? Like, for you, what is holding it back?
Well, I think the will of administrators mainly. I think that's. I'm sure I can't say. I do believe that the ECB would like to have a Test match every summer. I would say that. I think if you take Test cricket as a wider thing, not just women's Test cricket, what keeps Test cricket alive in this country is the fact that it's still men's Test cricket alive in this country is the fact that it still sells out. You'll still get 30,000 at Lords every day. There is still demand. It's probably still the most lucrative. It's still the most lucrative part of the broadcast deal, I think. I should know that. I think that's right. So I guess, and the test at Trent Bridge against Australia in the summer, women's test was great, but it wasn't a sellout for any of the 5 days. So perhaps that's part of it, because ultimately Test cricket is expensive to host, and that's not just the women's game finding that. That is very much the men's game, and frankly, 80% of Test playing nations at the moment, that is what they're finding. So that's not a new issue. It is new to women's Test cricket, because we're now talking about increasing the load of something that really for quite a long time was just sort of stagnating and not really, and sort of happened when it happened. There's that, and as I say, I think there is also, I do genuinely think there is a point here about matchups. You don't want to have if England played a 5-day test against Pakistan, for example, next summer, we are talking about two teams at very different points in their trajectory. And I mean, for what it's worth, Pakistan are growing as a side, and I think they've had a pretty good winter. And I think you'd hope that the more countries invest in the women's game, the more viable this conversation becomes for all nations. But equally, I don't necessarily see an issue with a mismatch. Like, mismatches happen. But yeah, it is. But I think ultimately, as with all these things, it falls to administrators, because say the players, unfortunately, the players can't just grab a bat and a ball, organise a game, and then rent out, edge batsmen for 5 days. Like, it's not on them. They can make their point, and they've made their point pretty clearly on this topic. And you'd hope that gets listened to. But as I say, I can't see why there isn't at least one test in every single multi-format series played. And also the sanctity of Test cricket doesn't help with this. People talk about, the way we talk about Test cricket, I don't think is always particularly healthy. I don't understand why teams that aren't necessarily the greatest in the world shouldn't be able to play a 4-day game of cricket or a 5-day game of cricket. So when I talk about mismatches, I mean, you don't want a game that could theoretically end in a day and a half. But I don't see issue with, I don't understand. There is no reason beyond the finances, I guess, why Pakistan shouldn't play Bangladesh in women's Test cricket. You've got to start somewhere. You can't just keep on saying we can't do this because they're not good enough, and then never allow them to be good enough. But as I say, I think that is a side issue to the main one, which is how Test cricket as a game in general, male and female, funds itself outside of big series, outside of big countries.
Yeah, I think you touched on all the points extremely well. I think lastly on this topic, I just wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned about the mismatch in kind of quality and resources, but with there not being much Red Bull infrastructure, is that like a big factor in this, or is it?
You mean domestically?
Yeah, domestically in each country.
It feels a bit chicken and egg, doesn't it? Like, it's a lot. If you take the men's game, if Test cricket died, hard to see how the county championship sustains itself, or why it would sustain itself. Because ultimately, the domestic game exists in large part to prepare you for the international game. Other reasons as well, particularly the men's game, where you've got teams who are 100+ years old. So, like, there is a tribalism, a history, a tradition to fall back on. In the women's game, where you don't necessarily have that side of it, because we've got these new 3-year-old regional hubs. I can understand why. It's a really interesting one, because England, DCB have said they're keen to play more Test cricket, and it always feels a bit odd to me that take the multi-format Ashes series, for example. It always feels odd that the game with the most points riding on it isn't a format that no one practices all year round. So there is certainly something to be said that even if you're playing a game a year, if it's going to be as it was in the summer, if it is going to be the marquee game in which the series is decided, why wouldn't you be prepping for it? I guess the answer, if you ask that question, the answer might be, well, would our Test 11, or who are we doing that for, really? I think there's more scope in the short term for a North-South series of the best players in the country to play some multi-day cricket, to play a multi-day series of 3-5 match series, maybe of 4-day or 4 or 5 day games. Then it's actually, if we're talking about having a domestic infrastructure that prepares you for Test cricket when there aren't many tests played anyway, rather than, as much as we're talking purely feasibility here, really, I guess, because there's no reason why there shouldn't be a women's Red Bull comp among the 8 regions. But if we're looking purely at how you develop a team for a Test match, I suppose the answer might be, well, we know what our pool is. and the pool is not the realistic pool for the next test currently is not 100 players. It's or however many players the contracts for the eight regions now. Realistically, it's likely to be 15, 20, 25 max, maybe. With a few bolters like Lauren Filer who actually got anything on the team because they liked the idea of having someone who was a bit taller, a bit quicker, who could make a difference when the ball wasn't swinging in the test. And obviously she's gone from there. Sort of the same reason. Izzy Wong made a debut. When was that? June 2022. So they've got a pool. Within that pool, there's definitely that they should definitely be playing much more red ball cricket. Feasibly, also as a feasibility thing, if it's feasible, I can't see why there isn't. If it is feasible, there isn't a reason why there shouldn't be an 8-team competition, other than what is it preparing players for if there is so little women's Test cricket. I certainly think the domestic schedule needs changing and needs increasing. I think it's something like 24. So yeah, you play 20. I think you play 24 group games in 2024 as women's regional player. 10 in the Charlotte Edwards, 14 in the AF Flint, plus finals games. So I think you'd effectively play 27, 28 if you won. If you won both comps, you'd play 28 games. I think is what it is. Because they now got semi-finals in both comps. 28 days of cricket across the summer is still not very much. Obviously, you've got 100 as well. So we're talking 28 days of cricket between April, May, June, July, September. Essentially, I know it's not quite how it works out, but 5 days of cricket a month is frankly not rubbish. There is much more space for much more. Whether that's a red ball comp or an increased white ball comp, that is, I guess, that is for the game to decide. But if you were going to have a red ball comp, I think you'd need. I think you'd want to know that's going to result in more Test cricket, or at least more opportunities to play it, or at least at the very least more reason to play it. So, if you know what I mean. So I think ultimately that is the main driver of the County Championship right now, from a men's perspective, is having a men's test, team at the end of it. What you can't have, going back to the David Davidson-Richards example, is a situation where you've got someone who's really good at it, previously is really good at it, plays one game, misses one game, and is now coming up to 18 months since her last game of red ball cricket, when she made 107. Same with Tammy, double 100 in a test match, doesn't get to think about red ball cricket for the next, 7 months, essentially, isn't it, for 6 months. So the whole, I would be completely in favour, which I hope I've made clear. But it is chicken and egg to a point. I can see, for example, why there isn't I can see why, I'm going to say this slightly blindly, I don't actually know if this is true, but I'm guessing there's no domestic red ball structure in Sri Lanka, for example. If you've not played a test match since 1998, you can sort of see why. And likewise, that is when we talk about sort of the mismatch thing. I don't necessarily think England should have played a test match against Sri Lanka in September. Because you're asking players who played an Ashes test 3 months earlier to play against players who very possibly haven't played a red ball game for 25 years. And obviously in that case wouldn't be the same players. So but you've got to start somewhere. And whether that is domestically, whether that is an increased test schedule, that is up to the game. But I do think it needs, and crucially, it shouldn't all be about short-term financial revenue. If you don't think you're going to sell out now, that's not a reason not to play something. It's a reason to market it better, so you do sell it out, or it's a reason to play at a slightly smaller ground, which I know is not the direction of travel for the game. But if you're playing Test cricket in front of 6,000 at a ground that is 6,000 capacity, that is almost certainly a better look than playing, and feels better than playing 6,000 where you could get 30,000 in. But you'd hope that those two move hand in hand with the way the game is going. And in a couple of years' time, you're in a position where England hosts Australia for another Ashes test, and it's selling out across 5 days, just like the men's is.
So it's almost on the ICC, the administrators, to put the games in, and then from there, can see what happens.
Yes, although ICC. I mean, ICC, as ever, particularly the women's game, could always do more. Should always do more. But there is nothing to stop. There's nothing to stop national governing bodies arrange a test match within their tour, as long as they're full test nations. I guess that's the only, which they obviously are in the context of the women's FTP, certainly where England are concerned. So yeah, I mean, it's on the boards. It's on the boards to listen to their players. You know, as I say, the idea that Susie Bates will retire without, I think I'm right in saying that. I'm fairly certain Susie Bates never played I mean, like you could look down that list of when countries last played Test cricket. So Deandra Dottin won't have played a Test. Bisma Marieff won't have played a Test. Susie Bates, Amelia Kerr, Sophie Devine, Hayley Matthews, Jemiah Patu. You know, we're talking there about some of the. I mean, talking players that's like 3 or 4 of the top 10 players in the world haven't played the format of the sport that chances are a lot of them grew up watching rather, and the sport and the format of the sport that even the women's game is where it's played so rarely is the pinnacle, which feels sort of quite profoundly unfair more than anything else. So I think the game, I also think, like, if you take the way the women's game has grown in England and the responsibility and the role played in that by the players, whether that was Catherine Siver-Brunt, Nat Siver-Brunt, Heather Knight, Tammy Beaumont, whoever it's been along the way, they done, and I mean, and obviously well before that, Rachel Flynn, Charlotte Edwards, Sarah Taylor, all these great sort of pioneers of the game. You'd think if I don't know, they've done so much for the game. You'd think if they say we need more Test cricket, just listen. Like, because everything they've done has, been everything they've done has been the role they have played in the growth of this game is enormous, and continues to be. And the more days of cricket they can play, the better. So chuck a 5-day game in the middle of it, then that can only be a good thing.
So I'll just set out. So the debate is, should we have 4-day or 5-day Test matches? And basically, for the argument in favour of the 5-day argument, obviously it's what men do. The Ashes was the first women's Test with play on all 5 days, and the quality of the cricket was insane. There was a great total of runs scored, and there was a good result, which proves that we need to see more 5 days and not draws. And then other writers were saying that there was no need for sporting declarations to keep the match alive, and both teams could play their innings out to a natural conclusion. And then the 4-day argument is more, sure, 5-day Test matches can be thrilling, but is there the infrastructure, as we've talked about earlier, and the standard that will deliver consistently? And you could maybe instead have more Test matches at 4 days between more teams and on more good surfaces. So yeah, the question is, where do you sit in that debate? And is there any more you want to add?
I've always just thought the 4-day argument is really weak. Like, you sort of summed it up there. Like the 4-day, I mean, when I said earlier that England haven't won since 2014, it's not like they've gone and lost every time they played. I've been at a very boring draw in 2019 when rain got in the way of a day and a half of it. So it was a 4-day game, essentially a 2.5-day game at Taunton between England and Australia. Australia needed a draw to retain the Ashes, so they did what any good team would do, and they didn't make a sporting declaration. They batted England out of it. There was no hope of result. There may well have been if that had gone 5 days. 2021 was Bristol against India, 4-day game. India blocked it out for a draw on the final day, some of which was rain affected. Used pitch, which was taken as a bit of an issue at the time, more optically, I think, than anything else. Actually, ironically, used pitch in a 4-day game is probably quite handy, because it's the only way, you if you have a really good batting streak for 4 days and you don't have, let's say, the extra pace of the men's game, when the ball goes flat, unless you've got a world-class spinner, you shouldn't take many wickets. And that's not just women's cricket, that's just the game in general. That was a draw. That was a good game of cricket, but But that was a good game of cricket, if I remember correctly, partly because of how enterprising some of the play were. I think Sophia Dunkley batted brilliantly. Shafali Verma in both innings went out and whacked it. So there were individuals in both teams who moved the game along. Remember Anya Shrubsole? Was it Shrubsole who belted it? Yeah, did she whack like 47, I think? Yeah, it was 47 off 33 balls. I can't remember if it was her, but yeah, that was a draw. 4 days. 2022 South Africa. England would have won it. Last day rained all day at Taunton, with South Africa following on, and a night watcher, Sekikune, I think it was, who was able to bat it out with, I want to say Marizang. Actually, I don't know if it was Marizang. I think it was. Point being, you've got 3 games there that were all impacted by the weather. They're just the home test. I mean, 4-day test in the brilliant 4-day test in Australia was a rarity. It was also born out of a declaration from Australia, 7 down, setting in at about 260 to win. In fact, 2 declarations from Australia. Now, when we said earlier about the exhibition side of it, and these being played as like one-off games where players every single time say that they all admit they almost sort of feel forced to put on a show because of so little Test cricket. It's almost like a come and get me plea for more women's Test cricket. This is what we can do. This is it. Give us more. You shouldn't have to play a game like that. You shouldn't have to play a pinnacle. You shouldn't have to play a game that's meant to be the pinnacle of the sport with that in the back of your mind. Oh shit, we've got to put on a good show for everyone, or else they won't give us another test. Part of that goes back. Part of that is the 4-day stuff. You can afford to play test cricket at the rate the Test cricket demands, at the rate that the game in front of you demands. If it's 5 days long, you'll generally get a result. And generally, if you don't get a result, it's either been played an absolute flat one, there've been a million runs scored, or you've ended up with quite a good finish. You only got to look at the men's county championship. Lancashire drew 10 out of 14 games last season in 4-day cricket. They play 14 games, so there is, draws are valuable. They add up over the course of the season. But a draw in a one-off game, it doesn't do anything for anyone. Why was it there otherwise? It doesn't impact the multi-format series in terms of the point structure. It doesn't, unless you added bonus points or something, which I don't think. I'd rather just have a game that you're more likely to get a winner or a loser from. And if you get a draw after 5 days and both teams played really well, whereas at the moment it doesn't feel like you have to do an awful lot, particularly if the pitch is slow and dead and scoring quickly becomes quite tough. You don't have to do an awful lot to avoid defeat and draw. And yeah, it just seems a really straightforward argument. I've never understood that. I don't even think there is a 4-day argument beyond really cynical administration. There's nothing about 4-day Test cricket, 4-day women's Test cricket, that adds to the spectacle that couldn't exist with 5 days. But what you do get is almost every time when it's 4 days, particularly in England, you always get rain, and then you always end up essentially, this is just journalists covering it, let alone a player. If you lose a day to rain, everyone there sort of knows how this is going to end. You've got to play bloody well to win a game in 3 days, at any level, and the opposition have to play bloody badly. It only takes someone to, pull the drawbridge up and say over my dead body, and chances are you get away with it. Whereas 5-day Test cricket, there is just less room for that, and so there's not a sporting reason, I don't think, that. And we may well see it in the next week with this India test. I don't know why it's gone to 4 days. I don't think it makes much sense. And we'll get one or two kinds of pitches. If it's really flat, it'll be a draw. And if it spins, it certainly won't be a draw. And if the 2 teams bat like they batted in the T20 series, probably won't need day 3.
Yeah, you've illustrated the situation perfectly. So
I
can't add anything. You've just covered it all, and it's like a symptom of the problem, like the fact that we only talk about it when this happens, and then we just don't talk about it again for 12 months. But
guys, really interesting thoughts there from Evie and Nick on the women's Test match and I think women's Test cricket in general, because it's quite. I mean, it's saddening, and it is a bit still shocking to me that we're still having this debate where the women's cricketers are battling for more and more Test cricket. It's been a while, it's been ages, and we have the same conversation again. It's like we're playing in circles. Toby, some great insights from Nick and Evie, but talking about the domestic structure as well, about having more tests, having 4 days or 5 days. What do you make of everything?
Yeah, no, it's a really good conversation. Personally, I like to see 5-day test matches. I think should be the same for men's and women's. I don't really see a reason otherwise. If anything, I'd say the women often seem to bat for longer and manage to score more runs than a lot of the men's tests, which in particular over recent years are lasting 2-3 days. I mean, you only have to go back to England last time in India, the men's side, when, what was it, down in Ahmedabad, 2-day test match, 3-day test match. So it's not that uncommon. And I think 5 days, I don't really see why there should be any difference between the men's and the women's game. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a shame that there's the continual talk about the need for more test match cricket, but there's never any action behind it. I mean, I absolutely love women's test match cricket. I love men's test match cricket. Just love test cricket generally. I was there at Trent Bridge last year for the Ashes, for the women's test match. It was a great 2 days out I had down there. Saw Tammy Beaumont double hundreds. And I mean, the 25,000 people who went down for test match seem to love it as well. So I don't really see any issues as to why there's not enough, or why they're not producing enough test match cricket. So I think it's an interesting conversation, and hopefully in the next sort of decade, next 5 years, there'll be some more action and more women's test matches.
And Michael, like Toby said, the Ashes test, I was going to speak to you about that as well. I think it's one of the most exciting test matches I've ever seen, be it men's or women's cricket. And it was great. A 5-day test. We got a result on the 5th day. So that's exactly what, we want with the women should have more 5-day matches as well. We saw it go down to the wire on the 5th day. Nick also mentioned about, there's no reason why the ICC and the other boards cannot have at least one test match in every series between the women, right? Now, the last 3 years cycle, just to put some context into this entire debate, the 2022 to 2025 cycle has 7 tests, which is as many test matches as we've seen in 7 years before that. That's just wild to me. And even though we have, now 7 tests in a 3-year cycle, it's still pretty less. Where do you stand on this entire thing? Why can't they have more test match? Why can't they have the women's team playing more test matches? And why are we still having this debate?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with everything Evie, Nick, Toby, yourself. 100% agree with everything you said. I don't understand why there's so few test matches, really. I think, like Nick said in the podcast earlier on, it's the most profitable part of the broadcast deal in the men's game, the test. So it obviously makes money. Like you just said, Toby, a lot of people turned up in the summer for the Ashes. It was a great occasion, amazing game. And yeah, I think I'm not sure what the reason is for it. Is it because they're trying to make women's cricket more exciting with lower, limited over matches, maybe? But yeah, I don't understand it. I love test cricket, and I definitely want there to be more women's games.
Don't we all just love test cricket? I mean, it's even the men's game where we're seeing the debate over the last few years for more and more test cricket, but with women, we need at least some test cricket, right? And another thing that, puts the women's game on the back foot is the fact that even in the test cricket that's there, it's just 4 teams that are playing. This 3-year cycle that I spoke about, 2022 to 25, 7 tests. Each of those tests feature India, England, Australia, and South Africa. 2 of those teams. We're not seeing so many of the other teams. I mean, take New Zealand, for example. And I did do an article as well about this, which you guys can read on Sports Gazette, about the women's test cricket and the match that's coming up. Was the likes of Susie Bates and Sophie Devine from New Zealand have never played a test match in their lives. It's just wild to think. Imagine that happening with someone like a Kane Williamson. It would be such a big deal in the men's game, wouldn't it? So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, we keep going around in circles. I think even Nick spoke about that, where the onus is on the administrators to kind of really take charge of this and get more and more women's tests. But yeah, I think they summed it up pretty well in what they discussed as well, Nick and Evie. And let's just talk more about this test match specifically, India versus England. First test, like I mentioned, the first test in India in 9 years. Every time I mention this, even if I mention it twice in the space of a few minutes, it just seems crazy to me. But yeah, let's move on from that. The first test happening here. England is the team that's played test cricket more recently. 6 months ago, the Ashes that we spoke about. India haven't played in a couple of years. The last time India played a test match was against England in England a couple of years ago. So, Toby, let me start with you on this one. What do you see happening in this test match? Because it's a big opportunity for England, given that they have more experience in test cricket and with more established players in the side as well, to get a win that they would cherish for a long time.
Yeah, I think it's quite a hard one to call, really. As you mentioned, England have played more recently, but I don't think that's actually saying that much or that useful to describe, because it was 6 months ago when they last played a test match. I mean, under normal circumstances, if Tammy Beaumont came off a double hundred in the last test in sort of the men's format, you'd kind of think, oh yeah, she scored a double hundreds, a few weeks ago or a couple of days ago, even if you're playing that consistently. Whereas when it's 6 months, it doesn't really feel like the form can be carried on that easily. So it's quite a hard one to call. You would think that England would hopefully be better prepared just because they have a lot more experience. I mean, Harmanpreet Kaur, the Indian captain, has played 3 test matches in a 10-year career effectively, which just doesn't really seem to make much sense and shows that they're not going to be that, not necessarily going to know that well how to play a test match. I mean, they obviously have watched a lot of test cricket and have played a few games, but there isn't that sort of natural ability almost. And a lot of the women's players for England will have the same kind of issues, I reckon. I mean, if you looked at, I don't know, a generic men's player after 3 test matches, you're going to say they're new to the game, they're still finding their way, they're still trying to work out how best to play test cricket. And it's the same for the majority of the women. I mean, Heather Knight's played 11 test matches, I think, over her 10-year, 15-year career, which is far and away the most, pretty much, I think, within the sides. So it's hard to call either way. I think you would have to put England just ahead because they have played a bit more. I think they probably also have a better lineup as well. I think having Sophie Ecclestone in there could be a game changer. She's such a good bowler. Number one ODI bowler, number one T20 bowler for God knows how long now. And probably going to be the number one test bowler if she can get a few wickets down in India, which you'd hope she would be able to.
She would. I mean, if there's someone that you bank on playing in those conditions, it is Sophie Ecclestone. Michael, talking about Ecclestone, I mean, she came back after surgery. It was a bad injury that she got at the 100, and then she was out for months, surgery, and she comes back, bowls in the T20 series that we just seen with India, as if she was never away. I mean, just coming, picking wickets for fun, helping England win the series 2-1. Do you think she's going to be the most important player given that we're playing in India, or someone like Nat Silverbrunt or Heather Knight?
Yeah, I mean, Ecclestone's probably the best bowler that England have. 10 wickets in the Ashes in the summer. Amazing performance there and really good in the T20s last week. But like you said, she has just come off, surgery. So that could play a part. Test cricket's more demanding. If she's bowling 40 plus overs, that's going to put a lot of strain on her. So yeah, I think pace might be a little bit more important. There's actually a really interesting article on BBC Sport looking at the games in the WPL and the IPL that were held at the DY Patil Stadium. And that actually, on average, there are more wickets from pace bowlers than spin bowlers. So spin bowlers average a wicket about every 20 runs, whilst pace bowlers average a wicket every 20 runs, whilst spinners is more about 27. So, in the test format, that could be quite interesting, and see Kate Cross leading England's attack. I think she could maybe have a bigger impact than Ecclestone across the test, but Ecclestone's an amazing bowler, and I'm sure she'll have a massive impact as well. And also, India's spin bowlers will probably have a lot of fun because England's batters aren't the best at playing against spin, but they've actually held a spin batting camp in Mumbai. The head coach has taken them there and done a little bit of practice on that. So maybe we'll see some improved performances. But yeah, so I think India spinners and England's pace bowlers are the ones to watch.
I think it's quite interesting you mentioned the pace there, because I think there's almost no guarantee, and Kate Cross in particular, I think there's almost no guarantee that Kate Cross does necessarily play. I think England actually could have a bit of a selection issue, or trouble on their hands anyway, because they have three very good seam bowlers. Kate Cross, Lauren Bell's very good, and arguably bowled better than Kate Cross for large parts of the Ashes. And Lauren Viola, who's come out of nowhere pretty much, debuted in that test match in the Ashes for England, and looked absolutely lethal, bowls best part of 80 mile an hour. And arguably that's more important on what could be quite a docile pitch in India, and often are quite flat pitches, so maybe a bit of pace could be useful. I'd assume that it might be Lauren Filer alongside Kate Cross, in which case together they might be able to take the new ball, get a few wickets. But I think it'll be interesting to see the selection and maybe the troubles they might have with that.
They've definitely got some good options with Nat Scarver-Brunt in there as well. Amazing. Some really good pace bowler options.
Very much so.
And yeah, it will be interesting to see, like you said, that, you know, they might go with one of Lauren Bell or Lauren Filer in the 11 eventually. And Lauren Filer, yes, I think maybe on current form as well. And the way she's just burst onto the scene, she could come in as well, but Lauren Bell would add a little bit of more variety to the attack. So yeah, it would be very interesting to see how they go with the selection as well. And that's something I spoke to Georgie Heath about as well, who's a freelance sports journalist, and is the host of the Women's Cricket Chat podcast. And Michael, there was something that you spoke about Sophie Eccleston with her workload management as well, because she's just coming off surgery. She's bowled a lot in these T20s, and there's going to be a reliance on her, almost an over-reliance on Sophie Eccleston to get those wickets if we do end up seeing a typical India wicket. So that's because Test cricket is the one format which is hardly played in the women's game. The prioritization is always for the white ball formats. And again, when you want to see, and when the top stars themselves want to play more Test cricket, the limited chances they get, there's a good chance that their workload management will be prioritized and they'll have to sit out the test. So that's another problem that women's Test cricket is facing in terms of its growth that we all want to see. But yeah, talking about a little bit about the Indian team as well. Yeah, they are the hosts eventually. It's surprising that they're not the favorites, but that's not their fault. Again, 2014 was the last time an Indian team played a home test match. And from this current team, it's only Smriti Mandhana and Harmanpreet Kaur that featured in that test. And out of the entire squad, there's just the two of them.
It's impressive that anyone featured in that test. 2014, 9 years ago.
9 years
and
ago.
They're still going. Fair enough.
So, I mean, it's kind of new terrain for all of these players. And even Smriti and Harmanpreet played that test 9 years ago, but it's still 9 years ago. So, yeah, you can't say that, oh, yeah, they have experience. They do generally, because they are the two of the most reliable players in the team. But yeah, with the Indian team, I think selection again is going to be interesting. I think it's pretty well set for now, the players that we're going to see. I'm personally really excited from a bowling standpoint, given we're playing in India, to see someone like a Saika Ishaq, great IPL as well. And yeah, she's just, again, a new player bursting onto the scene. It'll be very interesting to see how she goes in this test match as well. And again, it's Jemima Rodrigues making a test debut. And
mental.
Exactly.
Absolutely crazy.
Jemima Rodrigues, who's one of the stars of this team and now you can call her a senior player in this team, is playing her first test match. So I'm really excited to see how she does as well, because I think she's one of the most technically sound batters in this team. And it'd be good to see how she does. Shefali Verma at the top is always exciting. We do remember her bit of a battle of words with Catherine Silverbrandt the last time these two teams played. Unfortunately, Catherine Silverbrandt's not there, but Shefali Verma could get it going with someone else, maybe Kate Cross, you never know. So I think those kind of small battles will also be fun to see. And Deepti Sharma, I think, is going to be a big factor in this test for India as well.
I can almost guarantee Charlie Dean won't be leaving her crease too early to make sure the mankad doesn't happen again with that.
Well, that's going to be another big talking point
Very
there
much.
and it was again these two teams.
With the sort of Indian side, as you mentioned, none of them really playing Test cricket before.
Yeah.
Do you think that their skills are quite compatible and will transfer over to Test cricket very easily? Like Shafali Verma is a very aggressive batter, but I mean, there's been a lot of proof, particularly in like Bazball and the way that players like Danny Wyatt go about their game, that actually aggression can't necessarily be an issue and might often help them get on top of bowlers.
It could. I mean, I've thought about this with, players. The only option that they have is transferring their white ball skills to the red ball game, because they don't play even domestic cricket, multi-day red ball domestic cricket in their country. It's not just India. It's so many countries. I think all of them. They don't play. No one has a domestic red ball structure in the women's game.
Nothing sort of professionally or major enough anyway, no.
Exactly. So they're all left to kind of translate their skills and their form in the white ball cricket to the red ball. I think it's going to be dependent case by case. For some of them, it could work. For some of them, it can't. And again, it's no fault of their own. They should be playing more of domestic matches as well. You see in India, the Ranji Trophy being the feeder mainly for the long format. In England, the county championships being the feeder for the red ball test cricket. The women don't have that. So it's, again, that was to say that it's not their fault. But I think many of these players will, I think, successfully transition from white ball to red ball. Jamima, again, I think she will, because technically she's very good. She's one of the most dependable batters that we have in the ODIs and the T20s as well, because she's really improved her T20 game over the years. She was not thought to be a T20 player early on, but she did, and in the ODIs as well. So I think she'll come in well. She'll do really well. Shafali Verma, she's had a decent start to her test, how much of a test cricket that she's played as well. But I think, yeah, again, it's hardly anything. 1 or 2 test matches maybe. I think not more than 2 that she's played. But yeah, Shafali is more of a confidence player, I think. More like Virendra Sehwag is an Indian fan, how we remember him back in the day. In other cricket news, guys, before we wrap up today on the One Shot podcast, Michael and myself spoke to the academy director of the Rajasthan Royals Academy in London. So just give you a bit of a brief. Rajasthan Royals, the IPL team, have set up an academy at a couple of places in the UK, and the recent one is the London Academy. Michael and I got a chance to speak to Shaftab Khalid, who's the academy director over here in London, and we'll cut to some of the few important things that he told us. Shaftab, just going a little bit more towards the ethos of the Rajasthan Royals Academy. It's not just in the UK, but the RR has set up academies in different places in the world as well, not just moving from India, in other places as well. So if you could just tell me a little bit more about the origins of the concept of having the academy and what actually kickstarted this idea to kind of globalize, if I can say that.
Look, I mean, obviously, it's a massive, huge global brand. Rajasthan Royals, they were the first people who won the IPL, and obviously, since over a decade and so, the cricket has evolved so much. You see, many international players are, going on to play in IPL, and it's become such a global brand. Now, obviously, after that, effectively, then the franchise does look for having academies where they provide that opportunity for young aspiring cricketers to come through their academies to be able to be a part of the actual franchise team. So they already have started in India, and also then that expanded in Dubai, and then that expanded in London as well. So subsequently, obviously, at the aim and the ethos is to have that platform, like which I mentioned before, is to use that brand name and to get the players in, especially with that having that coaching staff, which is the main thing, which makes the core of it, to give you that opportunity, to give you that training program, to give you have that coaches that who's going to actually help you to go further. That's the main thing.
So, do you think that the academy is going to kind of have a good impact on young people from kind of less privileged backgrounds? I mean, I know cricket has got a bit of a reputation for being a rich kid's sport in England. Do you think
It
that
is, yeah.
this academy can kind of change that?
Yeah, I definitely think so because look, at the end of the day, you're absolutely right in terms of privileged kids, private school kids. Majority makes the county cricket, and because they have given the platform in terms of how many times they train in the school. Obviously, you get better and better, more training you do. But in terms of our way of Rajasthan Royals Academy in London, which has just been launched, is to provide some kind of subsidiary for the for around about 5 people in each age group, which we have let people aware of, the clubs and the parents. So especially those kids who's not very privileged in terms of paying paying the fee once the training program starts. So yeah, so we have done that in terms of providing that, giving them that opportunity to come and train with us and upskill their talent. And if they have got something in them, then trying to push them back into county cricket or even further.
Thanks a lot, Shaftab, for your time. Michael, I think it was a fun chat yesterday with Shaftab. Very, I would say, interesting chat more than anything. What was your biggest takeaway from everything that the Rajasthan Royals Academy is doing in London and the UK?
Yeah, it was an interesting interview. I think the best thing about this academy is the work that they're doing for the underprivileged kids. Moving away from the kind of reputation in England that it's kind of a posh kids sport, cricket. Giving them the opportunity that, maybe it's not going to replicate the opportunity that kids from private schools have, but hopefully a similar kind of, they'll definitely have more of an opportunity to kind of try and make their way into county cricket or even franchise cricket, but that will be rare. But yeah, it's definitely a good thing for young cricketers in England. I think we're going to see it more. We're going to see them expand to Yorkshire, Manchester, maybe even up north into Scotland. So yeah, it was an interesting one, good chat, and I've got an article out today on the Sports Gazette for the full interview. So yeah, give that a read.
Do give that a read, guys. It's up on the Sports Gazette along with the other content that we're doing. That was that from us on the One Shot podcast today. We'll be coming back with more episodes very soon. Toby, Michael, thanks a lot for joining us.
Cheers for having us. Another good first video episode done, which is happy to be done with.
Yeah, and we'll look to do more video episodes going forward. So stay tuned to the One Shot podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, take care, guys, and we'll see you soon.